It's Wednesday, April 30th, and we found out this morning that the US economy shrank in the first quarter of this year, the months of January, February, and March, at a 0.3% annual rate. So it was only just negative, but it was still negative. So what happened? What does this mean? What can we expect going forward? Well, it's definitely not good news, and there's not really a lot of ways that you could spin it positive, but we don't want to overreact. So this was a measure of GDP, our gross domestic product. It is the sum total of the US economy. It's truest measure of size. There are four things in its most basic form that make up the US economy, and we call them C plus G plus I plus X. C is the consumption of households, G is the consumption and investment of governments, uh, I is the investment and consumption of businesses, and X is net exports. Of these three things, they go in about descending order in size. About 65% of the US economy, sometimes it's 60, sometimes it's 70, is the consumption of households. So that's just what you spend your money on for goods, for services. You get a haircut, you hire a lawyer, you buy a bed. That is the consumption of households. That is the lifeblood of the US economy, you purchasing things. Well, what we found out January, February, and March, all of these things mostly went down. Consumer spending was growing at about a 4% rate. It dropped to a below 2% rate. But what actually caused the economy to shrink was net exports. And that was a very big, large number, close to negative 5%. What happened is that Trump has been saying on the campaign trail since becoming elected, and even targeting this April 2nd big beautiful day of tariffs, that he was going to pass broad and dramatic tariffs. Well, by now, pretty much everyone understands, but in particular businesses, that a tariff is equivalent to a price increase. So in February and March, as Trump's talk on tariffs turned into serious policy and more was about to come, businesses in particular started buying a lot of goods that they import. They were buying them ahead of time, like they were stocking up on imported goods. Consumers could have done this too, rush out to buy a foreign car, but consumers don't have the same savviness of necessarily where their products come from. Am I buying a foreign product versus a domestic product? But businesses definitely know where their suppliers are located, and if their suppliers are subject to import tariffs. And so what's ironic is that this is the whole guise of tariffs, is that it's meant to help U.S. exporters, but even the announcement of tariffs led to the largest trade deficit that the U.S. has seen in March, and it contracted the economy because people were rushing to buy imports. What's I think really worrying about this number, in addition to it's just not good if the economy is not growing, is that uh, none of this takes into account, none of this reflects the world of April. Right, we're at the end of April. It's just that's how long it takes for the data to be collected and compiled. But this doesn't take into account any of the 10% minimum tariffs, those days where we had 30% tariffs on certain countries. Somebody got 10, somebody got 35. They put up the big chart. China's now at 125. There's massive retaliation. None of that is reflected in this number. Everything that's reflected is the worry that just the announcement induced before we even knew what the announcement contained. And for a lot of people, the announcement was much worse than expected. So we won't find out about the second quarter's growth until July, right? We have to get through April, May, and June, and we find out at the end of July. But this is really worrying. The other problem is that consumer spending dipped. Now, like I said, this is the big one. But consumer spending dipped, and so has consumer sentiment. So you can see how this would be kind of like an accelerating process. I'm a consumer, and what I buy, if I'm buying at my normal rate or a little higher, that is what is driving a lot of economic growth in the United States. Well, if I'm worried about the economy, I might pull back on my spending. I might not go get as many haircuts or manicures or facials. I might not buy that new thing, but wait, I might put a pause on buying clothes for a couple of months because I'm worried. Well, that absolutely translates to a reduction in economic activity. And if it's large enough, we can see consumer spending go negative. And then that would be very bad for the economy because it's such a large part. Consumer spending did fall in the first quarter, but it didn't fall negative. We don't really have a lot to be optimistic about on that front, because were we to try and predict how much people would consume, some of that comes down to consumer sentiment. How do people feel? Well, that has also been cratering, and consumer sentiment has taken a nosedive for the months of February and March because people are so worried about the economy. So there's not a lot to be positive about. This isn't great news. Now, I want to be clear, it doesn't mean recession. We had a quarter of negative growth in 2022. It was much worse. It was a lower growth than this one. I think it was negative 1%, maybe negative 1.5. It was about 1. So it was negative and more negative than what we saw this quarter, and we were able to bounce back and not have a recession. So one quarter of growth does not mean it's certain doom and recession and we have no choice from here. We still have a chance to fight off a recession. I think what is most worrying now is it's not clear the federal government, in particular the Trump administration, wants to do that. I mean, he's making a lot of noise. He's yelling at Jerome Powell, the head of the Fed, but he isn't really reversing course on these tariffs, which is what is driving the uncertainty and the economic decline. So that was what we found out today. Truly, it was what I thought it would be. I thought it would be a really small negative number, but that's enough to drive a lot of panic and worry. It's certainly not a confidence boost. So, yeah, put your questions in the comments. In some ways, it's a kind of a straightforward economy can either get bigger and smaller. It got smaller. But in other ways, it's almost more confusing because of what drives it, what the relative shares are, and what it teaches us when things in certain parts of the economy go up or down. So, hard day, not a great day. Stay strong.